The night always smelled the same in that garage: diesel and cutting oil and the particular damp of old metal that hasn't moved in years. I had a half-rebuilt vintage engine on the stand, its crankcase open, and I was wiping my hands on a rag that was already past saving. The blueprints on the bench were weighted down with a torque wrench. The old truck under the tarp hadn't run since before I was born. They say a thing is only as good as the hands that made it. My grandfather told me that. He ran a restoration shop out of a converted barn, and he could mend anything: carburetors, clock movements, a neighbor's broken rice mill, a wartime field radio someone dug out of a hillside. He worked by feel as much as by measure, but his feel was calibrated by 40 years of measure, so it amounted to the same thing. When he died, he left me his micrometers and his habit of looking at broken things the way other people look at puzzles, not with frustration, but with a kind of patient attention, waiting for the object to explain itself. So could I. Mend things, I mean. Anything can be rebuilt if you understand how it was made. I was surveying a dead mine the week they were going to seal it. The commission was straightforward: assess the old ore cart winches, document their condition, determine whether any hardware was worth salvaging before the entrance was sealed for good. The mine had flooded years back, and the company had walked away from it, but the winch mechanisms were supposedly still intact in the upper gallery, above the waterline. Just another job. I went in with a headlamp and a notebook, and the particular alertness I always carry in old structures: not fear, just attention. Timber shoring, black water below, the smell of iron and cold stone. My headlamp beam caught a seam in the rock wall that I hadn't seen on the survey maps. The ore in it had a faint luminescence, wrong in a way I couldn't immediately name. Not phosphorescence, not reflected light, something else. I leaned in to look at it more closely. The seam flared. The sound was enormous, and then there was no sound at all. I woke on cold ground the color of ash. The surface under my palms was packed earth, gray and fine, and above me, far above, spanning the whole sky, was a dome of pale light. Not sunlight, not any light I had a word for. It was the color of something that had once been brighter, and it was fraying at the edges, the way old silk frays when you pull a thread. I lay there for a moment. My coveralls were still on, my headlamp was gone. And then it wasn't, I thought, meaning the mine, meaning everything I'd known 5 minutes ago. I sat up. This isn't the mine. It wasn't. It was a walled town. I've been in open-air museums. I've walked through reconstructed Joseon-era villages where the buildings were maintained by a historical foundation, and the forges were lit twice a year for demonstrations. This was nothing like that. This was old the way a working thing is old, worn where hands had touched it, patched where it had cracked, the walls thick and uneven with generations of repair. The streets were packed earth and stone, the roof lines were heavy tile, frost gray in the cold air. Beyond the walls, mountains rose on every side, iron dark, their slopes dense with pine. The ore in those ridges was visible even from here, rust-red veins running through the gray rock like old wounds. And over all of it, that dying light, the dome. Up close it was worse. I could see the structure of it, or thought I could. Not a single surface, but a layered thing, and the layers were separating. A walled town, old as a museum and twice as cold, and over all of it, that dying light. I was still trying to orient myself when I heard the screaming from the ward shrine. The shrine was at the town's center, built around an iron anchor the size of a cart, a massive casting, ornate, covered in inscription marks I didn't recognize. Around it, a ring of acolytes in gray robes were doing something with their hands, something that produced a faint light at their fingertips, and the light was supposed to be feeding into the dome above. I could see the logic of it, even if I didn't understand the mechanism. They were channeling, praying, pushing something through themselves into the structure overhead. It wasn't working. One of them, young, maybe 20, with the posture of someone trained to appear composed, had broken. Her hands were shaking. The light at her fingers stuttered and went dark, and the dome above tore. a long ragged gap opening in the pale fabric of it, and she looked up at it with an expression I recognized, the expression of someone watching a machine fail in a way they don't know how to stop. The thread won't hold, it won't answer. The crowd around the shrine surged backward. Someone was shouting, "The veil! The veil is tearing!" I wasn't watching the veil. Everyone was looking at the light. I was the only one looking at the iron. And the iron was just broken, a cracked casting, a seized linkage, a bearing nobody had greased in 100 years. The anchor at the shrine center had a secondary mechanism at its base, a linkage assembly, iron, connecting the anchor to a series of channels cut into the stone floor. The channels ran outward in a radial pattern, and I could see from where I stood that one of the linkage arms had seized. Rust and mineral deposit, decades of it, locking the joint solid. The acolytes were pouring energy into a system that couldn't transmit it because the mechanical connection was broken. They were praying to a machine that needed a wrench. "That's not a god," I said. No one heard me. I said it again, louder, to no one in particular. "That's a mechanism, and it's jammed." There was a fallen iron rod near the shrine's outer ring, part of a fence post, from the look of it, about 1.5 meters long. I picked it up. The crowd parted around me without quite deciding to, the way crowds do when someone moves with enough certainty. I got the rod under the seized linkage arm and found my leverage point. The joint had been frozen long enough that it wasn't going to move easily. I leaned into it, felt the resistance, adjusted my angle. You don't pray a frozen bearing loose, you break it free. "Come on, move!" The joint cracked. Rust and mineral scale showered down. The linkage arm swung through its arc and seated home with a sound like a bell being struck, and the light above us surged, the tear in the dome knitting shut from the edges inward, the pale fabric pulling itself back together, the acolytes around me gasping as whatever they'd been pushing suddenly found somewhere to go. I stood up. My shoulders ached. I set the iron rod down. The woman who approached me had the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed. She was perhaps 40, dressed in the armor of a military warden, and her hand was on the hilt of her sword, not drawn, but present, making its point. Behind her, the young acolyte who had broken was watching me with an expression that had shifted from terror to something more careful. "You," the warden's voice was even. "Outlander, you laid hands on the anchor of Iron Ridge and it obeyed you. Who are you?" I didn't have a good answer for that. I was still working out where I was. The young acolyte wasn't speaking aloud, but I could see her working through it. Her lips moved slightly, her eyes tracking from the linkage to my hands, to the sealed dome above. He didn't channel anything. He didn't even try. He just fixed it. I freed one anchor. There were a dozen more out there, all rusting, all failing. I could see them from here, secondary anchor points set into the wall at intervals, each one connected to the dome by the same radial channel system. Their magic was dying and it was never coming back. They knew it too. I could see it in their faces, in the way the crowd looked at the sealed dome with relief that was already curdling into dread, because they understood that the relief was temporary. The young acolyte spoke. Her voice had steadied, though the steadiness cost her something. "It fails everywhere now. We pray harder every year, and every year the light grows thinner. If the mandate is leaving us, what is left?" I crouched down and picked up a chunk of raw ore from the ground near the shrine's base. It had been used as a doorstop, or a weight, or nothing in particular, just a piece of the mountain that had ended up here. I turned it in my hand, heavy, dense, high iron content. From the color of it, and the mountains behind the walls were full of the same. What's left? These mountains are made of iron, and I know exactly what to do with iron. The warden was still waiting for an answer. The acolyte was still watching me. The dome above us was holding, for now, and the cold air smelled of pine and charcoal, and the faint mineral sharpness of ore. I stood up. I was still in my coveralls, still had grease under my fingernails from the engine I'd been working on 6 hours or 600 years ago. I looked at the fraying light at the dome's edges, then at the iron mountains, then at the chunk of ore in my hand. "Stop praying to it," I said. We're going to build something that doesn't need anyone to be born special. Neither of the Veil did the fighting for 1,000 years. Iron Ridge never had to learn anything else. I understood that before the sun rose on my second day, I was standing near the wall, or what passed for a wall on the frontier, a packed earth rampart reinforced with timber and something older, something that hummed faintly when you pressed your palm to it. And Warden Ji Wolyung was already there, watching the dark thin out over the ridgeline. She had the posture of someone who had not slept and did not intend to complain about it. At her feet, half sunk in the churned mud, lay a broken spearhead, then another, then a third, a handspan further along, snapped clean at the shoulder where the blade met the socket. 3 blades shattered on one beast last night, she said without turning. 3. She wasn't speaking to me in particular. She was speaking to the fact of it, the way you speak to a number that refuses to make sense no matter how many times you say it aloud. The warden didn't hang me and didn't kneel to me. She did something worse. She handed me a problem. She turned finally and held out the nearest broken spearhead. I took it. The fractured surface was bright and granular, the particular sparkle of steel that had been hardened past its limit and given nothing back. I'd seen that surface before, in my grandfather's shop, on tools that came in from people who thought hardening was the whole of the work. I ran my thumb across the break, no deformation at all at the edge, brittle as fired clay. You mended the anchor, she said. Mend this, or mend nothing and be gone by the next moon. The frontier feeds people who are useful. I turned the blade over. The geometry was sound enough. Whoever had ground it knew what a spear point was supposed to look like. Then take me to whoever makes your iron. There was exactly one man in Iron Ridge who worked iron, and he did not want company. Beiteho's forge occupied a low building near the center of the settlement, close enough to the well to draw water and far enough from everything else that a stray coal wouldn't take the town with it. Sensible sighting. The building itself was black with years of smoke, the thatch replaced at some point with fired clay tile, a smith who'd thought ahead or who'd learned from a fire. The bellows were large, double action, well maintained. I noticed all of this before I noticed Taeho himself, which is probably the right order. He was a big man, not tall so much as dense, the way iron is dense. You could tell by looking that he would be heavier than he appeared. 40 years of forge work had done things to his forearms that no other occupation could replicate. He stood in the entrance of his forge with a hammer loose in one hand, and he looked at me the way a man looks at something that has wandered into his territory and not yet understood its mistake. My forge, he said, my fire, my iron. Outlanders keep their hands where I can see them. I kept my hands where he could see them. Ji Wol-young said something brief to him. I gathered she had already explained the situation, or her version of it, and then she left us to it, which was either trust or indifference, and I wasn't yet sure which. Taeho went back to work. I watched. His hands were a master's hands. That was the first thing, and it was important, and I want to be precise about it. He was not a bad smith. He was an exceptional smith working with an incomplete method, and the difference between those two things is everything. He read the heat by color with an accuracy that most men never develop. He knew when the iron was ready to move, knew how long he had, knew by the way the metal responded to the hammer, whether he was above or below the right temperature. That knowledge lives in the hands and the eyes, and it cannot be faked and it cannot be rushed. He had it completely, but every blade came out brittle as glass or soft as lead, and he'd decided the gods were done with him. Bad ore, he said, not to me, while a finished blade cooled in the quench trough and I watched the water stop steaming. Bad luck. The mandate's leaving the iron same as everything else. Nothing to be done. I looked at the blade in the trough. I looked at the quench trough itself, at the temperature of the water, at the color the blade had been when it went in. I looked at the rack where the finished blades hung, waiting to be fitted to halves and sent to the wall. He quenches and stops. No temper. That's the whole tragedy right there. He hardened the steel and stopped. He'd been doing half the work his whole life and calling the missing half a curse. With a man like that, you don't argue. You make something. 1 chisel each, I said. We cut stone. If mine breaks, I leave and never touch your fire again." He looked at me for a long moment. The hammer was still in his hand. "Ha!" It came out sharp, almost a bark. "And when yours breaks, Outlander, then you've lost nothing but an afternoon." The calculation moved behind his eyes. He was not a stupid man. That was also important. He set the hammer down on the anvil face with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. He made his chisel first, and he made it well. Good stock selection, proper forging sequence, clean geometry. He quenched it in the trough with the confidence of long practice. It came out hard. He set it aside. Then I rebuilt the fire. I didn't ask permission. I adjusted the fuel, better charcoal, layered for airflow rather than packed, and I worked the bellows in a rhythm that fed the combustion steadily rather than in surges. The forge responded. The color climbed from the dull orange Teho had been working at, through bright orange, into the yellow white that a forge can reach when everything is right, a hotter, steadier heat than that forge had ever held. I heard Teho go still behind me. "I've never gotten it that color, not once in 40 years. He didn't say it to me. He said it under his breath, half to himself, and I pretended not to hear it because that was the right thing to do. I worked my chisel stock in that heat, forged the body, drew the edge, refined the geometry, and when it was ready I brought the temperature up one final time and quenched it hard, the same as he had done. The steel came out hard, and then I put it back. This is the part he'd never been shown. I let the residual heat from the body bleed back toward the edge. The steel, cooling unevenly, changes color as the thin oxide layer thickens. It runs through a sequence as reliable as a clock if you know how to read it. Straw first, a pale yellow that means the edge is still too hard, still brittle. Then bronze, deepening, the color of old coins. Then blue, a faint iridescent wash, the color that means the hardness has been bled back to the point where the steel will flex before it fractures. I pulled it at the blue. "You taught your hands to read the fire," I said. "Nobody ever told you what the fire was doing. That's all this is." We cut stone. Teho's chisel shattered on the third strike. The fracture was bright and granular, the same surface I'd seen on the broken spearheads in the mud by the wall. He stared at the pieces in his hand. Mine bit into the stone on the first strike and held. I worked it through the cut, 4 strikes, 5, feeling the edge track true, and set it down on the anvil face. Teho said nothing for a long moment. He picked up my chisel and turned it over in his hands. His thumb found the edge, tested it carefully. Then he tapped the body of the chisel against the anvil, a single light tap, and listened. I'd braced for a fight. What I got was a master craftsman, 40 years deep, hearing for the first time that the craft went deeper still. The chisel rang, a clean, sustained note, the sound that properly tempered steel makes when it's struck, not the dull thud of soft iron, not the flat click of something over hard and about to fracture, but a bell tone that hangs in the air for a moment before it fades. "It rings," Teho said. His voice had changed. The territorial edge was gone. What was under it was something older and more serious. "Mine never—" He tapped it again, listening. "It rings like a bell." He set the chisel down. He looked at the forge, then at me, then at the forge again. "Outlander." He said it the way you say a title when you've decided to use it. "You will teach me that, today." He gave me a hammer's place at his fire and clothes off his own back, his way of saying a thing he'd never say. The clothes were frontier work, heavy undyed hemp, a quilted jacket that smelled of charcoal and pine resin, leggings wrapped and tied in the manner of the settlement. Practical, warm, nothing that would catch on a tool or drag near a flame. He shoved the bundle at me without ceremony and jerked his chin toward the corner where I could change. "You'll not work my fire dressed like a madman who fell out of the sky." If only he knew. I changed. The coveralls I folded and set aside. They were already scorched at one cuff from the anchor work, and they had no place here anymore. I didn't think about it too carefully. There was work to do. We spent the rest of the day at the forge. I walked him through the tempering sequence, the fire management first, because without the right heat the rest is guesswork, and then the quench, and then the careful reading of the running colors. Straw, bronze, blue, he had the eye for it already. He'd been reading heat his whole life. He just hadn't known there was a second reading to do. By the time the light outside had gone from afternoon gold to the flat gray of early evening, he had done it himself 3 times, and the third time he pulled the blade at exactly the right color, without any word from me. He held it up and looked at it. He didn't say anything, he set it in the rack with the others. That was enough. In the corner, where nobody ever looked, someone else was learning too. I noticed her the way you notice something at the edge of vision, a small figure, very still, in the shadows near the fuel stack. The orphan girl. Cho-young, I would learn later. She had a scrap of iron in her hands, a piece of waste stock no bigger than 2 fingers, and she was holding it at an angle that caught the forge light, watching the surface the way Teho and I had been watching the running colors, mimicking the motion, practicing the reading with a cold piece of metal and the memory of what she'd seen. I looked away before she could notice me noticing. Some things you protect by not naming them. Night came down hard on the frontier. I was outside, checking the spearheads we'd retempered, 3 of them, the first batch, enough to prove the method before we scaled it, when I saw Warden G at the wall again. She was looking outward, toward the dark beyond the veil's pale margin, and I followed her line of sight. One of the anchor lights was guttering. I'd seen them from a distance before, those fixed points of pale radiance that marked the veil's anchoring points across the ridge. They'd seemed stable enough, the way a lamp seems stable until you notice the oil is low. This one was not stable. It pulsed twice, faint and irregular, and then it steadied again, but at a lower level than before. One fewer, or nearly. We had better steal now. We had days, maybe. Out on the dark edge of the world, the lights were still going out. Faster, Ji-wol-young said. She wasn't looking at me. She was still watching the distant light. Whatever he's building, it needs to be faster. The wind off the ridge carried pine and cold iron and the faint char smell of the forge behind me. I thought about the running colors, straw, bronze, blue, and about how much of what I needed to build still existed only as a sequence of steps in my head, each one waiting on the one before it. You cannot rush the colors. Nothing in this world was true. That was the thought I kept returning to, turning it over the way you turn a workpiece in your hands looking for the flaw. Better steel was a start. We had that now, or something closer to it than before. But a machine is not made of steel alone. A machine is made of tools that make other tools, and the first of those tools, the one that must exist before anything else can, is accuracy itself. A single true edge, a single surface you can trust. And there was not one in Iron Ridge, not one in the whole Yun realm as far as I could tell. Nothing here is true, I said, to no one in particular, though Teho was close enough to hear. Not one flat edge, not one straight line, not one thing I can measure against. I'm building on fog. The old smith grunted and did not look up from his fire. I could not blame him for that. He had spent 30 years building on the same fog and had never thought to call it that. The fog was simply the world. Files first. That was the logic I kept coming back to. A file is hard steel with teeth cut into its face, and almost everything else in the world is shaped by one. If you want to fit 2 surfaces together, you file. If you want to remove a burr, a casting skin, a proud edge, you file. A file is the hand's first extension into precision, and without a good one, every surface you make is a guess. We cut the teeth by hand, Teho and I, into hardened steel blanks, using a cold chisel and a hammer, and a rhythm that had to be kept even or the spacing went wrong. It was slow, and it was tedious, and my shoulder ached before we had finished the first one. All this fuss for a scratching stick, Teho said. This scratching stick, I told him, is the grandfather of every machine I'm going to build you. He made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite dismissal, which from Tahoe I had learned to read as something like respect. The harder problem came after. To make a thing accurate, you have to see the error, the high spot, the hair of difference between a surface that is true and one that only looks true. My eyes were not good enough. I knew this the moment I tried to compare two of the blanks against each other. I turned them in the light from the forge, tilted them, held them edge on, and could not say with any confidence which one was flatter. Which one's truer? I asked, holding both out. I genuinely can't tell anymore. Nobody's eyes were good enough. That was the real answer. The tolerance I needed was below what the human eye could resolve at arm's length, and I had no measuring instruments, no optical flat, no dial gauge. I had a forge, a hammer, a new cold chisel, and my own inadequate senses. That was when the girl from the corner handed me the answer. Literally. I had noticed her before, the way you notice something at the edge of your attention without quite looking at it directly. She was always in the workshop, always in the same corner near the scrap pile, sorting pieces of iron and steel by some method of her own. She was small and thin in the way that means not enough food for too many years, and her feet were bare on the packed earth floor. I had not asked her name. I had not thought to. She crossed the workshop without being asked, took the blank from my left hand, held it for a moment, then set it down and took the one from my right. A pause. Then she set both down and pointed. This one. This one's smoother. The other's got a wave in it by the end. I looked at her. You can feel that? She looked back at me with an expression that was not quite weariness and not quite confusion, the expression of someone who has learned to be careful about drawing attention to themselves. I went to the scrap pile and pulled out 6 blanks of varying quality. I had a rough sense of their order. I had made them over 3 days and knew which sessions had gone better than others. I set them in a row on the workbench and looked at the girl. Close your eyes. She did after a moment's hesitation. Tell me which is flattest, then the next, all the way down. She moved along the row slowly, fingertips reading each surface in turn. She did not hurry. When she reached the end, she went back and checked 2 of them again, then gave me the order. She was right, every time. Her ranking matched my own rough knowledge of the blanks, and then went further, distinguishing between 2 that I had considered equivalent. They were not equivalent. She was right about that too. They each feel different, she thought, or something like it. I could see it in her face, the faint bewilderment. Doesn't everyone know that? Nobody had ever asked what her hands could do. I learned her story in pieces over the days that followed, mostly from Taiho, who told it in the flat way of someone recounting weather. No family, no bloodline, no thread in the registry. The town called her the rat, and fed her what the dogs left. In the old order, the order of blood and mandate and inherited station, a child like her was worth exactly nothing, less than nothing, because she was a mouth without a claim. She had been in the workshop because the workshop was warm, and Teho had never actually thrown her out, which was the closest thing to kindness the old order had offered her. I thought about that for a while. Then I took one of the finished files, the best one, the one I had spent the most time on the teeth of, and I crossed the workshop and knelt down so I was at her eye level, and I held it out. In my trade, I said, hands like yours are worth more than any bloodline in the kingdom. I need an apprentice with a true touch. That's you, if you want it. She stared at the file, then at me. Her expression had gone very still. You're laughing at me. I have never been more serious in my life. Take the file. A long moment. The forge crackled. Somewhere outside a dog barked twice and went quiet. She took the file. Teho said nothing about it. He didn't have to. That evening he moved a stool to the warmest part of the fire, not near it, at it, the spot he usually kept for himself, and set it there without comment. And from that night forward, there was a bowl that was always somehow full. A man came by the next day, one of the town's minor merchants, and said something I will not repeat. Taho looked at him for a long moment over the anvil. Stool's there, he said to the girl without turning his head. Don't read into it. Then to the merchant. And you, say that word again, I'll fold you into the anvil. The merchant left. Nobody said that word again, at least not where Teho could hear it. The acolyte Seirin had been coming by the workshop for her own reasons. She was meticulous about the veil's anchor points, and the forge sat near one of them, and she liked to check it while she was in the district, but she started staying longer. I noticed her one afternoon sitting beside the girl with a piece of charcoal and a flat stone, drawing marks. "This mark is 3, she said. "If you can write the number, young, one day you can write down exactly how true a thing is, forever." The girl Young, I had her name now, Choyoung, looked at the mark for a moment. "So other people can feel it too," she said, "even if their hands can't." Sorin paused, and something moved in her expression that I could not quite name. "Yes," she said, "exactly that. Two people the old order had no use for, building the new one between them." I did not interrupt. I went back to my files. The three-plate method. I had been putting off explaining it because explaining it meant committing to it, and committing to it meant acknowledging how much depended on it going right, but there was no more putting it off. To build any machine worth building, I needed a perfectly flat reference surface, a surface plate, a datum, the thing everything else would be measured against. And there was not one in Iron Ridge, there was not one in the Yun realm, there was not one anywhere in this world that I knew of. You cannot find flatness, you cannot buy it, or pray for it, or inherit it. You have to make it out of nothing, with no flat thing to start from. And there is a way. I sketched it in the ash beside the forge, 3 rectangles labeled in my rough approximation of the local script, arrows showing the rotation sequence. 3 plates, I said. Teho was watching, arms folded. Young was watching from her stool. Rub them together, turn by turn, A on B, B on C, C on A. 2 plates can lie to each other and match a curve. 2 convex surfaces can nest against each other and both feel flat. But 3 cannot all agree on a curve at once. Scrape down whatever stands proud, and the only shape all 3 can agree on, the only shape that satisfies all 3 pairs, is true flat. Teho was quiet for a moment. "You can grind flatness out of 3 crooked rocks," he said slowly, "with no flat thing to start from. The whole modern world stands on this trick. Watch." We had no measuring glue, no engineer's marking compound to transfer the high spots from one plate to another. We used candle soot, rubbed onto one surface and pressed against another, reading the transfer marks to find where the plates were touching. It was crude, the marks were ambiguous. I could see roughly where the contact was, but roughly was not good enough. So we used Young. Her fingers were the most accurate gauge in the kingdom, and she was 14 years old and had never owned shoes. She would run her fingertips across the sooted surface after each rubbing cycle, eyes half closed, and tell me what she felt. Not in technical language, she didn't have it yet, though Sudin was working on that, but in plain description that was precise enough to work from. "Here, and here." She moved along the surface of the first plate, barely touching it. "This corner stands proud. The middle's low now. Careful." "That's it. That's exactly it. Again." We scraped. A hand scraper is a simple tool, a piece of hardened steel with a cutting edge, drawn across the surface to remove thin curls of metal from the high spots only. The skill is in reading where the high spots are, and taking off no more than necessary. Too much and you create a new error. Too little and you make no progress. Young found the high spots. I scraped. We rotated the plates through the sequence, resuited, rechecked, scraped again. It was slow. It was the kind of work that requires you to stop thinking about the goal and simply do the next step and the next, and trust the method. The method was sound. I knew it was sound because it had been proven for 2 centuries in a world I no longer lived in. The question was whether we could execute it with the tools we had, which were a scraper, candle soot, and a 14-year-old girl's fingertips. The answer, it turned out, was yes. The nights were getting shorter. Not in the seasonal sense, in the sense that Seorin counted the anchor lights on the Vale's perimeter every evening, the pale fixed points that marked where the mandate was still holding, and every evening there were fewer of them than the evening before. She told me about it without drama, the way she told me most things. She had a recorder's instinct, state the fact, note the date, move on. 2 more gone since the new moon, she said one night, looking out past the edge of the workshop toward the horizon where the lights should have been. We are making miracles, and we are running out of nights to make them in. I did not have an answer for that. I went back to the plates. Young slept with the file in her hands for a month. I know because I came in early one morning and found her on the stool by the banked fire, curled around it the way a child curls around something precious, her cheek against her own wrist. The file lay in her open palms. She had not been told to put it away, and so she hadn't. I stood there for a moment in the gray pre-dawn light, listening to the forge tick as it cooled, and thought about what it meant to be given a thing that was yours, not borrowed, not permitted, yours. She had never had one before. Mine, she was probably thinking, somewhere in whatever dream she was in, this one's mine. The first thing that had ever been hers, the first proof that she was somebody, not by blood, not by the old order's accounting, but by what her hands could do and what those hands were worth to the work ahead. In the world I was trying to build, that was the only measure that mattered. The procession came up the frontier road like a wound dressed in silk. We had drawn attention. You cannot mend a holy anchor with peasant hands and expect the center not to hear of it. They sent the past, dressed in silk. Word had traveled faster than I'd hoped, slower than I'd feared, and now the whole of Iron Ridge stood along the road's edge in the gray morning light. Smiths and charcoal carriers and tannery women and children who'd never seen a court palanquin, watching the column wind up through the pine scrub and the soot-stained air. I heard someone near me say it aloud, as though naming the thing might make it smaller. The court has come to Iron Ridge. What does the capital want with us now? No one answered. We all knew the answer. Lord Inspector Ryugam stepped from the palanquin with a fan already raised against the smell of us. He was tall in the way that men who have never carried anything are tall, unhurried, unbent, and his robes were the deep blue of a court that had not yet admitted it was failing. He surveyed the gathered crowd the way you'd survey a collection of cracked vessels, looking for the one worth examining and dismissing the rest. His eye light, that faint luminous thread that the mandate's strongest carriers wore like a second iris, flickered once as he turned his gaze across the rooftops, and I filed that detail away before I'd consciously decided to. Lord Inspector Ryugyam, one of the last strong threads of the mandate left alive. He looked at us the way you'd look at something on the bottom of your shoe. So this is the frontier, he said, and the fan moved in a slow, contemptuous arc. It smells of smoke and desperation. How fitting. Warden Ji Wolyang stepped forward to receive him. She bowed, a correct bow, the precise angle the court required, not a hair's breadth more, and the rigidity of it told me everything. The warden had faced down raiders and a failing veil and a winter that killed cattle in their stalls. This bow cost her more than any blade ever had. Ryugam let the silence stretch before he spoke, because men like him understand that silence is also a demonstration of power. The court hears irregularities, he said at last, his voice carrying easily across the square. An anchor of the veil, touched and quieted by a hand with no thread in it. That sounds like heresy, or a lie. Jiwalyang straightened. It sounds like the truth, my lord. The anchor holds. The town lives. Names matter less than that, on the frontier. He smiled at her the way a man smiles when he has already decided the conversation is beneath him, and turned to address the crowd. What came next I had been half expecting. He called up the mandate, drew it visibly, the way court officials do when they want to remind a room of its proper order. And for a moment the air between his raised palm and the sky above us went luminous, a column of pale cold light that made the gathered townspeople flinch back and drop their eyes. It was real power. I won't pretend otherwise. Whatever the mandate was, whatever substrate of the world it drew from, it was not nothing, and the light it made was not a trick. But it guttered. Just once, just for a heartbeat, the column of light shivered and compressed, like a candle flame when a door opens somewhere in the house. His fingers tightened, the light steadied, he smiled wider, and the smile was practiced enough that most of the crowd probably missed what had preceded it. I didn't miss it. Behold what your betters were born holding, he said, and his voice had recovered all its steadiness. The power that keeps the dark at bay, not ironmongery. He let the light die, and turned from the crowd as though the demonstration had gone exactly as intended. Then he found Seorin. I watched his gaze move across her face, the way a man's gaze moves when he recognizes something he wasn't expecting to find. A flicker of recalibration, quickly smoothed. She was standing at the edge of our group in her acolyte's gray, her ink-stained hands folded, her expression giving nothing away. But he knew the blood. Whatever the Yun line had lost in status, it had not yet lost the markers that a court-trained eye could read. Yun, he said, and his voice had shifted, softer now, almost solicitous, the register of a man offering something rather than taking it. Here, in the soot, with the smith and the rat child, your line held a thread once, faded now, but the blood remembers. Come back to the temple. This is no place for someone born to better. I glanced at Sorin. Her face was still, but I'd worked beside her long enough to read the stillness. She was not unmoved. Away back, everything she'd lost, the temple and the thread and the name that had once meant something in the capital, offered in a single sentence, with one hand extended and the other kept carefully out of sight. She didn't answer him. She didn't have to, not yet. The offer would sit in her like a splinter, and he knew it. He moved on to me. He circled me the way you circle a curiosity, not with any real weariness, but with the particular attention of a man who wants to understand what kind of small, harmless thing has caused him a large inconvenience. The famous outlander, he said, no thread, no name, no blood. Show me the trick you used on the anchor. I am curious what kind of charlatan fools an entire frontier. I told him the truth. It turned out to be the most dangerous thing I could have said. There was no trick, I said. A part was broken and I fixed it. The anchor isn't a god, it's a mechanism. Anyone could mend it, if they understood how it was made. The silence that followed was a different kind than the one he'd used on the warden. This one was involuntary. He looked at me for a long moment, and something moved behind his eyes that wasn't contempt, or wasn't only contempt. Anyone, he repeated very quietly, you stand in the ashes and tell me the sacred is a machine, that anyone might wield it. He paused. Do you understand what you would unmake if that were true? I understood exactly what I would unmake. That was rather the point. He didn't wait for an answer. He turned from me and walked into the workshop, and the rest of us followed because there was nothing else to do. He looked straight at the most important object in the kingdom and saw a dirty rock. The flat plate sat on the workbench where we'd left it. 3 stones worked against each other by the 3-plate method over the course of weeks, ground down by hand scraping and chalk and a 14-year-old's fingertips until the high spots were gone and the surface was what a surface was supposed to be. It was not beautiful in any way that Ryugem's education had prepared him to recognize. It was gray and heavy and slightly cold to the touch, and it looked like nothing. He nudged it aside with the edge of his slipper, the way you'd move a stone out of your path on a road. Peasants playing with stones and scratching sticks while their betters hold back the night, he said, scanning the rest of the workshop with the same dismissive sweep. What is this rubbish even meant to be? Chayoung was standing beside the bench. She'd been there when he walked in, and she hadn't moved. She was holding the straight edge, the one we'd made to check the plate's progress. A bar of iron that had taken its own long hours of filing and scraping to bring true. She looked at the plate, then at the inspector's back, and then she laid the straight edge across the surface. No light passed beneath it, not at any edge, not at any angle. The fit was complete. She didn't say anything aloud. She didn't have to. The thought was plain in her face. No light gets through. Not anywhere. We made it true. Sorin, standing beside her, looked from the plate to Ryugam and back again, and her expression was the quietest thing in the room. He is looking at the future, and he cannot even see it. He had turned back to face the warden. Hear me, warden. The softness was gone now. Unsanctioned works that ape the mandate are a hair's breadth from defiance of it. When I return, this heresy of iron will have stopped, or I will stop it. Jiwol Young met his eyes. We'll note the court's concern, my lord. He didn't understand what he'd seen, but men like him can always smell a thing that threatens them. He left us the way he'd arrived, with ceremony, with silk, with the crowd parting before the procession and closing behind it like water, and we stood in the workshop and listened to the sound of the palanquin bearers' feet on the road until there was nothing left to hear. The warden was the first to speak. "You've made an enemy of heaven itself, Smith," she said. She wasn't angry. She was doing what she always did, measuring the weight of a thing clearly so she could decide how to carry it. "You understand that?" "Heaven's running out of fuel, Warden." I'd seen it in his hand, the same sputter she'd seen, the same involuntary tightening of the fingers. I watched it sputter in his hand, same as you did. "We're not. Bet on the side that's still burning." She looked at me for a moment, then she nodded once and walked out into the afternoon. The palanquin was already half a li up the road when Ryugyum let the mass go. Alone in the curtain dark, the bearer's rhythm steady beneath him, he reached for the mandate the way you reach for something you've carried your whole life without thinking, the reflex of a man who has never had to wonder whether his hand would find what he was reaching for. It barely answered. A thin thread of light, cold and reluctant, pulled in his palm and guttered there like the last coal in a dying brazier. He stared at it. The fan was folded in his other hand, and his knuckles had gone white around it. "Come," he thought, or perhaps said. The curtains were drawn, there was no one to hear. "Come, damn you." The light flickered. Why won't it come? That was the real reason the court feared us, not because our iron was heresy, because their light was going out, and ours was just being lit. That night the forge was the warmest place in Iron Ridge. The veil flickered at the edge of town, that pale dome of failing light that was the only thing standing between the frontier and whatever moved in the dark beyond it. But inside the workshop, the flat plate sat on the bench and caught the lamplight and gave it back steady and even the way a true surface does. Bakta was there, and Choyoung, and Sorin, and the warden had come back without explanation and stood near the door with her arms folded. We were all looking at the plate, and none of us had quite found the words for it yet. Let the court watch. We had a true surface now, the one thing every machine in history was ever built upon. Magic was dying out there in the dark. In here, something new had just caught fire. "Tomorrow we use this plate to build the next one," I said. "Then ways, and a slide, and a spindle. Then we build the machine that builds the machines." Bekteho scratched the back of his neck. "I have no idea what half those words mean, Smith." I looked at the plate. I looked at Young, who had laid a straight edge across 3 ground stones and found no light passing beneath it, and who understood, maybe better than any of us, what that meant. The flat plate sat on the bench like something salvaged from a different world, which in a sense it was. I had spent 3 days getting it there, rough forging the blank, rough grinding it on a bed of wet sand, then the long meditative work of scraping, a thin wash of soot on the surface, a careful press against the reference, and then reading the high spots by where the soot transferred and where it didn't. Scrape the high spots, repeat, scrape, check, repeat. By the end my forearms ached in a way that felt earned rather than wasted, and the plate was as flat as anything in Iron Ridge had ever been, which meant it was the flattest object in the kingdom, because nothing else had been made this way. One true thing, that's all you need to start. From one flat surface you can make a second, and a straight edge, and a square, and from those, everything. That's not philosophy, that's just how the geometry works. I set my hands on either side of it and looked at Choyoung, at Baek Tao, at Yoon Sorin standing with her ledger already open, brush poised. The lamp threw orange light across the bench. Outside, the veil made its faint, sourceless hum, a sound I'd stopped noticing except when it wavered. "This plate," I said, "is the only honest object in the kingdom. Today we teach it to have children." The second plate came first. I walked Chayoung through the process, the soot wash, the press, the reading. Her hands were small, and her touch was extraordinary. She'd grown up measuring cloth and grain by feel, and she understood pressure gradients the way some people understand music. She scraped where I pointed, and stopped when I told her to stop, and she didn't scrape where she thought it needed it, which was the harder discipline. Teho watched from the forge, arms folded. his expression the particular closed look of a man who has been competent for 40 years and is now being asked to reconsider the basis of that competence. His job was the straight edge. He'd forged the blank himself. He was good at that, better than good, and now he was learning to check it by the same soot and scrape method, rocking it against the first plate, reading the contact pattern, correcting. He was slower than Young, not because his hands were worse, but because he kept wanting to do it by eye. A smith's eye is not nothing, but it is not a reference surface. Scrape, check, he muttered, working the scraper in short strokes. My whole life I just hit it until it looked right. This is a different kind of patience. I didn't answer that. It was true, and he'd arrived at it himself, and that was worth more than anything I could have said. The tri-square was the piece I'd been thinking about since I started. A square is easy to make badly. You can eyeball a 90-degree angle and get something that looks right, and it will be wrong in a way that compounds every time you use it. The problem with a bad square is that it feels fine. It passes casual inspection. It only reveals itself when the errors accumulate, when the box you built won't close, when the shaft you turned runs out of true, when the machine you assembled binds, and you can't find why. The trick I'd learned from my grandfather's shop was the self-checking flip. You scribe a line against the square, then flip the square and scribe against the same edge again. If the square is true, the two lines are one line. If the square is off, the error appears doubled. The two lines diverge by twice the error angle, which is suddenly visible even to an unaided eye. The tool checks itself. Honesty built into iron. I showed them the flip. The first try produced two lines that were almost one. Almost. I handed the square back to Tejo without a word. He looked at the lines for a long moment, then went back to the scraper. The second try was better. The third try was right. A square that can prove it's a square, I said, holding it up to the lamp. No faith required, just the test. Sorin had been writing the whole time. She wrote down the method of the soot wash, the direction of the scraper strokes, the meaning of the contact pattern. She wrote it the way she'd once copied temple sutras, with the same careful hand, the same sense that the words were load-bearing. I'd noticed that about her. She understood that a method written down was a different kind of object than a method carried in someone's head. The unit of measure came next, and it was the step I'd been most careful about. You can't just declare a length. You need a physical instantiation, something you can hand to someone else, something they can copy, something that doesn't change with temperature or humidity or the mood of the person holding it. I'd made a rule from a piece of close-grained hardwood, sealed with linseed oil, with a fine line scribed at each end and at the major divisions. The length itself I'd chosen for practical reasons. It divided cleanly into the dimensions I expected to need most often, and it was short enough to be carried in a coat. I set it on the bench beside the plate, the straight edge, and the square. From now on, this length is one rule, I said. Every part we ever make answers to this mark. Sorin looked at the rule for a moment. Then she looked up, and I could see her working through something. So two people who never meet, she said slowly, could make two halves of one machine, and they would fit. I hadn't said that. I'd been about to, eventually, when the moment was right. But she'd gotten there herself, from the logic of the thing and the way she said it. Two people who never meet carried a weight I hadn't expected. She understood what interchangeability meant, not as a manufacturing convenience, but as a kind of social fact, as a way that knowledge could propagate beyond the person who first held it. Yes, I said, that's exactly it. She looked back at her ledger and began to write. If it is only in your hands, she said, not looking up, it dies with you. If it is written, it is true for everyone, forever. I didn't have anything to add to that. Tejo's objection came in the late afternoon when we were fitting the first set of dividers, and the light through the workshop door had gone the color of old bronze. A good smith feels when it's right, he said. He wasn't being difficult, he was being honest, which was something I'd come to respect about him. He didn't pretend to agree when he didn't. I thought about how to answer that. The easy answer was dismissive and wrong. The true answer was harder to say without sounding like I was diminishing him, which I wasn't. Your feel got you halfway in 40 years, I said, and it dies with you. Numbers get the other half, and a boy can learn them in a season. That's the difference between a smith and a civilization. He was quiet for a while. He picked up the dividers and turned them over in his hands, hands that were mapped with old burn scars, that had held iron at every temperature iron could be held at, that knew by touch what a piece of metal would do before it was struck. Those hands were not nothing. They were 40 years of accumulated knowledge, and I meant what I said. They'd gotten him halfway. The feel was real. It was just mortal and unteachable, and that was the problem. He set the dividers down. He didn't argue further. Young's moment came near the end of the day when I handed her the tri-square and asked her to check the bench corner we'd been using as a reference. She pressed the square into the corner, the way I'd shown her. Then she pressed her fingertips into the same corner, reading the gap by touch, the way she'd always done. She held very still. Then she looked up, and her face did something complicated, surprise and recognition, and a kind of relief, as if something she'd suspected but couldn't prove had just been confirmed. It feels what I feel, she said. The square, it knows the same thing my fingers know. I understood what she meant. For her whole life, her hands had been her instrument, and she'd had no way to verify them except by comparison to other hands, other feels, other guesses. Now she had a tool that agreed with her, that spoke the same language, that could carry her knowledge into iron and wood and stone and hand it to someone else. The square wasn't replacing her touch, it was translating it. I didn't say any of that. I just nodded and told her to write down what she'd found. The attack came after the second watch. I was at the bench, working on the divider pivot by lamplight, when I heard the sound from the wall, not the veil's usual hum, but something lower and more urgent, a tearing quality, like cloth pulled past its limit. Then the shout, "Brace the gate! Hold the gate!" Warden Ji Wolyung's voice carried even at that distance. I was already moving. The veil had torn at a weak seam on the northeast face. I'd seen that section before, the pale light thinner there, the dome's geometry slightly wrong, like a scar in glass. Whatever had come through was at the gate now, and the gate was old iron, old brackets, old faith in the smith's eye that had made them. A finger's width of iron was the whole distance between a held gate and a dead town. I knew that before I reached the wall. I knew it because I'd looked at those brackets when I first arrived and seen what they were. Good work by the standard of feel, the standard of it looks right, the standard that had served Iron Ridge for 2 generations and was now, in this moment, being tested past what it could bear. The old bracket sheared. I heard it, a sharp crack, distinct from the general noise of the fight, the sound of iron failing at a stress point it had never been designed to handle because it had never been measured. Beside it, on the post we'd reinforced 3 days ago with a bracket made to the new standard, drilled to true dimension, fitted without slop, the iron itself worked to consistent temper, the new bracket held, the gate held. The smith's iron holds. Warden G's voice again, and something had changed in it, not just command but conviction. Push them back. Push. They pushed. The defenders had true-tempered spears that didn't shatter at the socket, because the socket had been bored to fit the shaft, and the shaft had been turned to fit the socket, and neither had been made by feel alone. The spears held, the gate held, the wall held. By the time the sky began to lighten, the blight things had retreated into whatever they retreated into, and Iron Ridge was still standing. Warden G found me at the gate in the early dawn, studying the 2 brackets side by side. She didn't speak for a long moment. She was looking at the same thing I was, the sheared stub of the old bracket, the clean fracture surface showing the grain of iron that had been worked by eye and hammer and 40 years of feel, and beside it, the new bracket, still solid in its bolts, the hole drilled true, the iron consistent through its section. I knew what she was thinking because it was visible in her face, the face of a woman who had commanded this wall for years, who had trusted the old iron because it was all there was, who was now doing the arithmetic of what that trust had cost and what it might yet cost if nothing changed. One was made by habit, she was thinking, one was made true, and only one of them is why I'm alive to tell the difference. She turned to me. Every bracket on that wall, she said, every blade in this town, remake them true. She paused. The frontier is yours, Smith. I looked at the gate, at the wall, at the pale dome of the veil above it, with its thin seam on the northeast face, and I thought about what it would take, not in abstract terms but in actual terms, the number of brackets, the number of blades, the forge time, the scraping time, the fitting time, the time to teach each step to someone who had never done it. Then I need more than my hands and pecs, I said. I need hands, a lot of them. We laid the tools out on the bench that evening, the flat plate, the straight edge, the tri-square, the rule, the dividers, and beside them Salin's ledger, open to the first page of measurements, the brush marks still crisp. The old temple at the edge of town kept relics behind locked screens, objects too sacred to touch, too old to use, their original purpose half forgotten. The priests spoke of them as repositories of the mandate, of the divine authority that had once made this land whole. I had no argument with what they believed, but I knew what kind of objects actually carried a civilization forward. Ours, anyone could learn. That was the whole point. The plate could teach the second plate. The square could check itself. The rule could be copied and copied again, and each copy would answer to the same mark, and the part made in one workshop to that mark would fit a part made in another workshop to the same mark, by hands that had never touched, in a town the first smith had never visited. The ledger would carry the method past the death of every person in this room. That was what we'd built today, not just tools, the conditions under which tools could multiply. I put my hand flat on the plate, cool iron, smooth past the threshold where smooth becomes something else, something that takes light differently, that your skin reads as a kind of silence. The town had one forge, one smith, and one engineer who hadn't slept a full night since arriving. That arithmetic was not going to work. I understood it the way you understand a bad tolerance stack, not as a single catastrophic failure, but as the accumulation of small insufficiencies, each one acceptable in isolation, each one compounding the next until the whole assembly seizes. One shop could not outproduce a failing veil. One pair of hands could not outwork the mathematics of collapse. I had been trying anyway, the way a man will keep tightening a stripped bolt, long past the point of reason, because stopping means admitting the thread is gone. The morning I finally stopped, I walked to the center of the market square and said it plainly. I don't need strong backs or noble blood. I need people who can learn. Anyone, everyone, come and learn. The words landed in the square like a stone into still water. A few heads turned, then a few more. Iron ridges overlooked, the ones who had learned to stand at the edges of things, to take up the least possible space, began, cautiously, to drift forward. A woman with ink-stained fingers, a boy of maybe 12, who had been sweeping the apothecary's step, two men from the eastern quarter whose names I did not yet know. They move the way people move when they half expect to be told they've misunderstood, that the invitation wasn't meant for them. It was meant for them, specifically for them. I can't outwork this. I have to outteach it. That was the whole of the plan, such as it was. He came late in the morning, after the initial crowd had sorted itself into the curious and the committed. I noticed him because he held himself the way veterans hold themselves, weight distributed with the unconscious precision of someone who has learned that the ground is not always trustworthy, and because his left sleeve was pinned at the elbow, the fabric folded and secured with the neat economy of long habit. He stopped at the edge of the gathering and did not drift forward with the others. He watched. When our eyes met, he crossed the distance between us with his chin up. What use is half a man at an anvil, Outlander? His voice was level, not bitter, the way a man sounds when he has asked a question so many times it has worn smooth. Don't mock me with charity. I looked at him, the way he'd read the crowd in 30 seconds, the way he'd positioned himself with sight lines to every approach, the way the younger men near him had unconsciously shifted to give him room, not from pity, but from some animal recognition of authority. Can you teach frightened men to hold a line? I asked. A pause. Something shifted behind his eyes. Then you can teach them to hold a tolerance. I don't need your arm. I need what's in your head. His name was Do Guang. He had held a mountain pass for 3 days with 14 men and no resupply. He did not tell me this himself. I learned it later, in pieces, from people who said it the way people say things they consider obvious. He stood there in the market square for a long moment, weighing something I couldn't see, and then he gave a single short nod and stepped into the group. The boy arrived at a run. He was perhaps 16, slight, with the kind of energy that has nowhere adequate to put itself. It came off him in visible waves, in the way he couldn't quite stand still, in the way his hands moved when he spoke, as though they were trying to help the words along. I can learn. I learn fast, I swear it. Pick me, please, I'll work all night. Beside him, a familiar face, Cha Young, my first apprentice, who had the grace to look both fond and exasperated. Breathe, Jay, he already said everyone. The boy, Mok Jae, stopped, blinked, looked at me, then at Cho Young, then back at me, as though verifying that the world had in fact arranged itself in his favor. Then he grinned, and it was the kind of grin that makes a room feel slightly warmer, and I thought, this one is going to be trouble in the best possible way. Not everyone in the square was pleased. The respectable folk gathered at a distance, the way respectable folk do when they want to observe something they disapprove of, without being seen to participate in it. I heard the comment clearly. It was not meant to be quiet. Cripples, rats, and a madman from the sky. This is the rabble that's going to save Iron Ridge? The laughter that followed was the small, mean kind. I was calculating how to respond, whether to respond, when Warden Ji Wol-young's voice cut across the square with the clean precision of a cold chisel. Their iron held the gate 3 nights ago, while you barred your doors and prayed. The laughter stopped. Ji Wol-young did not raise her voice further. She didn't need to. There was a quality to her stillness in that moment, a cold anger, the kind that has been compressed rather than vented, that made the air around her feel thinner. The next mouth that calls them rabble can go stand on the wall themselves. She let the silence sit for a moment. Anyone? No? No one answered. The respectable folk found other places to be. I filed the moment away. The warden had her own reasons for everything she did, and I had learned not to assume I understood them. But I was grateful, in the spare way I am grateful for things, the way you're grateful for a square that checks true, without needing to make ceremony of it. The first problem was Baek Tae-ho. Not that he was unwilling. Tae-ho was, in his way, deeply willing. He wanted the cohort to learn, I think, in the same way he wanted the iron to behave, which was to say with the full force of his considerable will, directed at the outcome, and a limited patience for the gap between desire and result. The difficulty was that Tae-ho had learned his craft in his hands over 30 years, and his hands knew things his mouth had never been asked to explain. I watched him try 3 times in one morning. Each time he would begin with some confidence, demonstrate a technique at the anvil with the fluid economy of genuine mastery, and then turn to find the apprentices watching him with the polite blankness of people who have seen something happen very quickly and understood none of it. You hit it until gah! He set down his hammer, picked it up, set it down again. You feel it. How do I say what my arm just knows? That's why we wrote it down, Beck, I said, so you don't have to. He looked at me with an expression that was not quite gratitude and not quite resentment, which I had come to understand was his version of considering a point seriously. The technical notes I had been drafting, the accumulated process knowledge, reduced to marks on paper, were not a replacement for his hands. They were a scaffold, a way to give the apprentices enough framework that Tae-ho's demonstrations could land somewhere instead of passing through empty air. He grumbled. He always grumbled. He also began, slowly and with visible reluctance, to use the notes. The training was not elegant. Slow is smooth, smooth is accurate, accurate is everything. Again, I said it so many times in those first weeks that it stopped being words and became something closer to a rhythm, a cadence the cohort could carry in their bodies while their hands learned the work. File, saw, square, read the rule. The same motions, repeated until the motion stopped requiring thought, until thought could be freed for the next layer. They were not a natural cohort. They were the people Iron Ridge had decided it did not need: the veteran with one arm, the orphan boys, the woman who had been told her whole life that this kind of work was not for her, the man from the eastern quarter whose accent made the merchants speak slowly at him as though he were simple. They had in common only that they had been discarded, and that they had come forward anyway when someone said come. That turned out to be enough. Doguang found his place within the first 3 days, and it was not at the anvil. It was in the space between the anvil and the door, in the way a workshop breathes, the flow of bodies and tools and attention that determines whether a place is safe or merely lucky. He had spent 20 years keeping men alive in conditions that wanted them dead, and a forge workshop, it turned out, presented a recognizable set of problems. A clean shop is a shop where everyone still has all their fingers tomorrow. His voice carried without effort, the voice of a man accustomed to being heard over noise. He was looking at a young man from the eastern quarter who had let his attention wander toward the fire in the forge. You, eyes on your work, not the fire. The young man snapped back. Doguang moved on without ceremony. I watched this and thought, foreman. The word fit the way a well-made part fits its housing, without forcing, without play. By the end of the second week, Mokje had filed his first true surface. I was not present for the exact moment, but I heard it, the sound of Chayoung's voice, which I had come to associate with careful understatement, suddenly carrying something unguarded. It's flat, Jay, it's actually flat. You did it. I came around the bench to find Mokje holding the piece of iron with both hands, turning it in the lamplight, his face doing something complicated. He was 16 and had spent most of his life being told, in various ways, that things were not for him. And now he was holding a surface he had made true with his own hands, and Choyoung had checked it and confirmed it, and the world was briefly arranged in a configuration he had not expected. I did it! The words came out louder than he intended. He caught himself, looked around at the other apprentices who were now watching him, and seemed briefly uncertain whether to be embarrassed. Then he held the piece up. I made something true! The embarrassment didn't win. The joy did. Several of the other apprentices grinned. Even Teho, at the far end of the shop, made a sound that was not quite a grunt and not quite approval, but lived in the neighborhood of both. I turned back to my own work. The feeling in my chest was not quite pride. Pride implies ownership, and this was his, but it was adjacent to something, the satisfaction of a process that has produced its intended result, multiplied by the fact that the process was a person. Sorin came in the evenings. The acolyte had her own reasons for everything, as the warden did, and I had learned to accept the help without requiring full accounting of the motivation. She sat up in the corner of the workshop after the day's physical training was done, when the apprentices were tired and their hands needed rest, and she taught them letters and numbers by lamplight. She was a better teacher than I had expected, which I recognized as a failure of expectation on my part. She had a way of making the abstract feel necessary, not useful in the vague future tense way that adults use to motivate children, but necessary now, in the specific and immediate sense. A craftsman who can read can learn from someone who died before he was born. Her voice in the lamplight was even, unhurried. The apprentices were watching her with the particular attention of people who have been given something they didn't know they were hungry for. That is the closest thing to immortality I have ever found, closer than the temple ever offered me. The last sentence landed differently than the rest. I saw a few of the apprentices register it, the small shift of expression that means a person has heard something that rearranges something else. Salyan did not elaborate. She moved on to the next character, the next numeral, the chalk marks accumulating on the board she had brought from the acolyte's hall. Late one evening, Teho and I stood at the edge of the workshop and watched the cohort work. The lamps threw warm light across bent heads and moving hands. The sound was the sound of people learning, not the fluid competence of mastery, but the slower, more effortful sound of skill being built from nothing, stroke by stroke. Half of them can barely hold a file straight, Smith, Teho said. Today, I said, you're not building tools, Beck. You're building the people who will build the tools. That outlasts every blade you ever forged. He was quiet for a moment. I could not tell if he was persuaded or simply tired. With Teho, the two sometimes looked the same. The lamps burned late. That was the last thing I noticed before I left for the night. The workshop still lit, the cohorts still bent over their work. Doguang's silhouette in the doorway, where he had positioned himself to watch both the interior and the street beyond. He was not looking at the apprentices. He was looking at the dark outside the circle of lamplight, the dark where the veil's pale edge was visible, if you knew where to look, thinner than it had been a month ago, the light of it more like memory than presence. I could not hear what he was thinking, but I had learned to read the set of a man's shoulders, and what I read in his was not fear. It was the particular readiness of someone who has waited a long time to have something worth defending again, and who intends this time not to waste it. Let it come, his posture said. This time we'll be ready. This time it'll mean something. I left him to his watch and walked back through the dark toward my own work, carrying the arithmetic of the day. One forge, one smith, one engineer. And now, finally, the beginning of something that might actually be enough. Not because the tools were better, but because there were more hands to hold them, and those hands were learning. The discarded, building the thing that would outlast the order that had discarded them. The veil flicked, the mother of machines. That was what I called it, standing before the cohort with a piece of charcoal and a smooth plank of pine serving as my drawing board. I had sketched the outline in broad strokes, the bed, the headstock, the tailstock, the tool rest, and when I stepped back and looked at what I'd drawn, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Not hope exactly, more like the recognition of a path. This is the mother of machines, I told them. Build it, and we can build almost anything, even the thing that finally gets us out from under that dying sky. No one looked up at the veil. They had stopped doing that as often, which I took as a sign that they were learning to think about the work instead of the deadline. The veil was still there, pale and thinning at its edges like old paper held to a lamp. But the forge was lit, and the plate was flat, and we had for the first time since I'd arrived in Iron Ridge, something that deserved to be called a plan. It was Cho Young who asked the question I'd been waiting for. She was crouched at the edge of the drawing plank, tracing the sketch with one finger without touching it, reading it the way she read surfaces, by the shape of the air above them. She looked up at me with that particular stillness she had, the one that meant she was about to say something that cut straight to the bone. But if you need a lathe to make a lathe, and there's no lathe, how did anyone ever make the first one? The others went quiet. Even Teho, who had been half listening from the forge mouth with his arms folded, turned to hear the answer. It is the genuine hard problem. I had sat with it in my grandfather's shop as a boy, turning it over the way you turn a stone to find the flat face. Every precision machine in the world traces its lineage back to some first crude thing, and that first crude thing was made by hands, and hands are not precise. The paradox is real. The answer is not a trick. Our first lathe will be wood and string and shame, I said. That's fine. It only has to be good enough to make its replacement. We built it over 3 days under Dokwang's supervision, and I will say this for the one-armed foreman, he understood the assignment before I finished explaining it. He had a way of absorbing a principle and immediately translating it into the specific sequence of tasks required, which is rarer than people think. Most people hear a principle and nod. Dokwang heard a principle and started sorting lumber. The frame was pine, jointed and pegged, with a treadle cut from a single curved bough that Mokche had dragged in from the woodpile with the air of someone presenting a gift. The drive cord was twisted hemp, routed over a large wooden pulley at the headstock and back down to the treadle crank. The tool rest was a notched beam, adjustable in height by wedge. The headstock spindle was iron, one of the few iron parts, forged by Teho to my specification, seated in wooden bearings lined with tallow-soaked leather. It looked, if I am being honest, like something a clever child might build to impress a parent. It looked like it would fall apart if you sneezed near it. Doguang walked the length of it with his one hand trailing along the bed, checking for twist. He stopped at the tailstock end and looked back along the line of it, one eye closed. Measure it against the rule, Jay. Twice. We do it true even when it's only wood. Mokje scrambled for the straight edge, eager in the way that only the very young can sustain, that unguarded enthusiasm that hasn't yet learned to protect itself with irony. He measured. He measured again. He reported the numbers to Doguang, who listened without expression and then made two small adjustments with a mallet and a wedge before nodding once. That was enough. That was the standard. The ways, the flat-bearing surfaces along which the tool rest and tailstock would slide, were the heart of it. A lathe is only as true as its ways, and the ways are only as true as the surface you scrape them against, which brought us, as everything in Iron Ridge eventually did, back to the plate. Everything in the end comes back to that first flat thing. We had scraped the master plate in the third week after my arrival, using the three-plate method, three cast iron blanks scraped against each other in rotation until the errors cancelled out, and what remained was flat to within what our blue and our touch could detect. It had taken longer than I'd wanted, and produced more arguments than I'd expected, and at the end of it we had three plates that were as close to true as Iron Ridge could currently achieve. One of them lived on a dedicated bench, wrapped in oiled cloth when not in use, touched only with clean hands. The reference plate, the seed. I brought Choyoung to the wooden lathe's bed with a pot of marking blue and a scraper. The plate was never the goal, Young, I said, watching her apply the blue in a thin, even film. It was the seed. Watch what grows out of it. She didn't answer immediately. She pressed the bed surface down onto the blued plate, lifted it, and held it up to the lamp. The blue transferred to the high spots in a pattern I was learning to read, a constellation of contact points that told you, if you knew how to listen, exactly where the surface was lying and where it was hiding. Choyoung knew how to listen better than anyone I had met in this world or my own. She set the bed back on the bench and picked up her scraper, a short, stiff blade with a burnished edge, held in both hands with her thumbs riding the flat. She worked in short strokes, each one placed with a deliberateness that looked unhurried but covered ground quickly. After a few passes she stopped, pressed two fingertips to the surface, and moved them in a slow arc. Hi, here, she moved her hand, and a long low along this edge. Don't chase it, ease into it. A pause. The fingertips settled. There, feel that. That's true. I leaned in and put my own fingers where hers had been. I felt the difference, barely, the way you feel the edge of a shadow, and I understood again why I had started calling her the touch. The instruments we had were adequate. Her hands were better. Someday I would build her instruments that matched what she could feel. That was a project for a later Tuesday. Taeho forged the remaining iron parts to my drawings, the spindle, the faceplate, the tool post screw. He worked with the focused silence of a man who has decided to take something seriously, which from Taeho was a form of eloquence. When he lifted the spindle from the quench and held it up in the forge light, turning it slowly, I could see him reading it the same way Choyoung read a scraped surface, looking for the truth of it. How close on this spindle, Smith? He asked, though the question was directed at me. Closer than you think you can, I said. Then we'll make it closer still on the lathe it's going into. He looked at me for a moment, with an expression that might have been skepticism, or might have been the beginning of understanding, then turned back to the anvil. The spindle, when it was done, was not precise. It was close. It was close enough to seat in the wooden bearings and turn without binding, and that was all we needed from it now. The lathe would do the rest. That was the point of the lathe. The first spin happened on the fourth morning, with everyone present who had any reason to be present, and several who didn't. Doguang had said nothing about an audience, but word had traveled through the compound the way it always did, and by the time we had the drive cord tensioned and a piece of iron rod chucked in the headstock, there were more people standing at the workshop door than I had known were in the compound. Mokje took the treadle, because he had asked 3 times, and because his legs were young and the treadle was stiff. He pushed down and the cord pulled, and the spindle turned, and the faceplate turned, and the iron rod turned with it, and I brought the tool rest up, and set the cutting edge against the spinning iron, and felt the resistance, and leaned in and pushed through it. A curl of iron came off, thin, irregular, breaking almost immediately into chips rather than a true ribbon, but it came off. The rod was being cut by a machine. The machine was cutting metal round. It's alive? Mokje's voice cracked upward into something that was not quite a shout and not quite a laugh. It's making it round by itself. The others were less demonstrative, but no less affected. I could see it in the way they leaned forward, the way Dogwang's jaw tightened, the way Choyoung's hands went still at her sides. Something had changed in the room. Something had been demonstrated that could not be undemonstrated. I kept cutting. The cut was not good. I knew it before I measured it. I could feel the flex in the bed every time the treadle reached the bottom of its stroke. A slight give, a micro-hesitation in the cut, repeated at the frequency of Mokje's leg. That flex was printing itself onto the workpiece as a spiral pattern, shallow but visible in the right light. Chatter from the tool rest, run out in the spindle, probably from the leather bearings compressing unevenly under load. All of it fixable, none of it fixed. I took the part off the lathe and held it to the lamp. Sorin appeared at my shoulder with her calipers, which she had been carrying since the third episode of this project, with the air of someone who has found their purpose. She measured in silence for a moment, moving the calipers along the length of the part with the methodical patience that I had come to recognize as her particular form of intensity. Then she straightened and read the numbers to the room. Out of round by this much. She held up the calipers so the gap was visible. Tapered here, more material at this end than that one. She set the calipers down. Now we know exactly what the next one must be. That was the right way to look at it. The errors were not a failure. They were a map. Moksha, to his credit, waited until Sorin had finished before he said what everyone was thinking. Master Han. He looked at the lathe with the expression of a boy trying to be diplomatic about something that was clearly, visibly, undeniably ugly. It's really, really ugly though. The laughter that came out of me surprised me. It had been a while since I had laughed without thinking about it first. It's a grandmother, Jay, I said, the first ugly step towards something beautiful. Everything we ever build will be descended from this wobbling pile of sticks. He considered this with the seriousness that children bring to things that adults have decided are worth considering seriously. Then he nodded, apparently satisfied, and patted the treadle beam with something that looked remarkably like affection. The name stuck. By evening everyone was calling it grandmother. Dogwang used it without irony, which was the highest endorsement available. That night I sat with the part Seorin had measured and looked at the numbers she had written in her careful, even hand. Out of round, tapered, chatter marks at a regular interval. Each error was a message from the machine about what the machine lacked. The flex in the bed said, "You need a stiffer bed, iron not wood." The runout said, "You need a better spindle, turn true on a machine that is already true." The chatter said, "You need a tool rest that doesn't move." To fix those problems, I needed a better lathe. To make a better lathe, I needed better parts. To make better parts, I needed grandmother. This was the staircase. This was always the staircase. I thought about Choyoung's question from the first morning. How did anyone ever make the first one? And I thought about all the workshops in all the centuries where some craftsman had looked at a crude thing they'd built with their hands and thought, this goes into the next one, which will be better, which will make a better one still. The bootstrap paradox resolves itself not in a single leap, but in a sequence of steps, each one standing on the one before, each one reaching for the one above. You don't solve it, you climb it. The veil was pale at the edges of the sky. The forge had banged to coals. The workshop smelled of iron and pine resin and the particular sharpness of fresh-cut metal, which is a smell I have always found clarifying. This one's wood and wobble, I said to the dark, to no one, to grandmother sitting in the corner with her drive cord slack. The next one it builds will be iron and true. I set Sorin's measurements on the bench where I would find the crude lathe stood at the center of the workshop like a confession. Do-jin had built it from seasoned pine and iron fittings, treadle-driven, with a headstock that wobbled less than it had a week ago, which was not the same as not wobbling at all. The shaft blank was clamped between centers, waiting. Everyone else was waiting too. Everything we're going to build stands on this one shaft being true, Do-jin said. He looked at the blank, then at the faces arranged around it, Taeho with his arms folded, Do-gwang leaning on the doorframe, Mokjae standing close enough to the work to be a hazard. Cho-young sat apart on an upturned crate, hands resting in her lap. So, let's find out if it can be done. He set the tool and nodded to Mokjae at the treadle. The frame shuddered. The cutting iron bit into the blank, and immediately the whole assembly began to argue, a harsh, rhythmic screaming that climbed in pitch and then broke apart into something worse than noise. The surface it left behind was rippled, as though the steel had been dragged across corrugated tin. Do-jin raised a hand, and Mokjae let the treadle slow. Chatter, he had known the word since his grandfather's shop, known it the way you know the name of a common illness, abstractly, until you catch it yourself. The whole thing was flexing and fighting the cut, the frame, the tool post, the blank itself, everything moving in slightly different directions at slightly different moments, each motion feeding the next, until the cut became a kind of argument the machine was having with itself. So we just fix it? Mukja said. How? Do-jin looked at the ruined surface. He thought about lying, about projecting the confidence that had carried them through the charcoal trials and the bellows rebuild. He decided against it. That's the honest part, Jay. I don't know yet. We find out by failing on purpose until the failures tell us. Mokjae's face went through several things in quick succession. He settled on a nod that was not quite convinced. The first iteration was bracing. Do-jin had Taeho forge iron gusets and bolt them to the frame's weakest joints, triangulating the corners the way a carpenter would stiffen a gate. They remounted the blank, reset the tool, and ran the treadle again. Better. Still wrong. The chatter was quieter, but it was still there, still inscribing its signature into the steel. Shallower ripples now, a slightly higher frequency, as though the machine had simply learned to argue in a smaller voice. The blank came off the centers and went onto the scrap pile. Do-jin wrote notes in the margin of his survey ledger. They set up another blank and tried again. The days accumulated, the scrap pile grew. At some point it passed the height of Mokjae's shoulder, and Do-jin noticed the boy measuring himself against it one morning, without quite meaning to, the way you measure yourself against something that is beating you. The pile was a record of everything they had learned and everything that had not been enough. It was also just a pile of ruined iron, and iron cost. The whispers started quietly, the way they always do. A few of the outer apprentices, the ones who had joined in the early optimism and had not yet been tested by anything difficult, began to find reasons to be elsewhere in the afternoons. Do-jin heard the talk secondhand, through Do-gwang, who reported it without editorializing in the flat foreman's voice he used for facts he did not enjoy. Pile of broken iron and a pile of broken people, heaven's not in it. He did not answer it directly. There was no answer that would satisfy people who were looking for permission to stop. He kept writing notes and setting up blanks. It was Taho who surprised him. The blacksmith had been the hardest convert, the one who had pushed back longest on every new method, who had demanded proof before he would abandon what his hands already knew. He had become, over the months, something close to a true believer, which made it worse when Do-jin came into the workshop one evening and found him sitting on the bench with the particular stillness of a man who has been thinking for a long time. Maybe some things just can't be made true, Smith, Taeho said, not angry, sad, which was harder. Maybe we're reaching for something never meant for hands like ours. Do-jin did not answer immediately. He picked up the most recent ruined blank and turned it in the lamplight, feeling the rippled surface under his thumb. He set it down. Get some sleep, he said. We run it again in the morning. Taeho looked at him for a moment, then nodded and left. Do-jin stayed. Alone, The workshop contracted to the radius of the oil lamp. The lathe stood in the middle of it, patient and indifferent the way machines are. It had no opinion about whether it was being used well or badly. It simply did what the forces acting on it required. That was the problem. The forces acting on it were wrong, and Do-jin did not yet know which ones to change. I know it can be done. He had turned true shafts before, in his grandfather's shop, on machines that had been refined over generations to eliminate exactly the failures he was seeing now. I know it was done. Somewhere in the long history of the craft, men with worse tools and less understanding had solved this. That's not the same as knowing how to do it tonight. He sat with that for a while. The lamp guttered in a draft from the door crack and recovered. The problem with knowing a destination is that it does not tell you the road. He had been reasoning from the answer backward. Chatter is resonance. Resonance has causes. Causes can be addressed. But the causes were multiple, and they were interacting, and every time he addressed one, the others shifted. The frame stiffness, the tool geometry, the depth of cut, the treadle rhythm, the mass distribution of the whole assembly, any of them could be the dominant factor on a given run, or none of them, or all of them together in some proportion he had not yet found. He was still sitting there when Choyoung came in. She did not announce herself. She rarely did. She moved through the workshop the way she always moved, with that quality of attention that was not quite sight, her hands trailing lightly over the bench edge, the frame of the lathe, the surface of the most recent ruined blank. Do-jin had stopped being surprised by her. He had started, instead, to watch what she touched and in what order, because her hands went to the things that mattered. She rested her palm against the tool post for a moment. Then she pressed two fingers lightly to the frame near the headstock. It digs, she said, then it lets go. Then it digs, same beat, like the tools bouncing. Do-jin looked up. She was not looking at him. She was still touching the frame, her head slightly tilted, as though she was listening to something he could not hear. Bouncing, he said, a rhythm. The thing that had been sitting just behind his thinking for 3 days moved forward into the light. Resonance, not just flexing, resonance. The tool was not simply deflecting under load. It was deflecting at a frequency that the frame was willing to echo, and the echo was reinforcing the deflection, and the whole system was locked into a cycle that repeated itself with the precision of a clock. Same beat. He had been treating it as a stiffness problem when it was a frequency problem. Mass would change the natural frequency of the frame. Tool geometry would change the excitation frequency of the cut. And the treadle rhythm, the rate at which Mokshe was driving the blank past the tool, was the input that was feeding the whole system. Young, he said, you just found it. She took her hand off the frame and said nothing. She sat back down on her crate. Do-jin worked through the rest of the night in the ledger, not sleeping, which was not unusual. By the time the others arrived in the morning, he had a list. Mass first. The frame needed weight, not just stiffness, but inertia, the kind that resists being moved at all. He had Taeho and Dogwang pack the hollow sections of the frame with flat stones mortared in place, adding mass to the headstock end where the measurements showed the greatest amplitude of movement. It was not elegant. It worked on the same principle as a millstone, a thing heavy enough to ignore the forces trying to disturb it. Tool geometry second. The cutting iron was reground, a slightly more obtuse angle, a narrower cutting edge, a geometry that would take a thinner bite and generate less of the interrupted force that had been exciting the resonance. Do-jin did this himself, at the grinding stone, by feel and by the angle of the light on the freshly worked bevel. The treadle rhythm was the third element, and it was the one he could not fix in the ledger. That one required Dogwang. The one-armed foreman had a gift for tempo that Do-jin had noticed early and filed away. He could hold a beat the way a drum holds it, not thinking about it, just doing it, the rhythm living somewhere below conscious attention. Do-jin explained what he needed, a cadence slow enough to give the tool time to clear its cut, steady enough not to introduce its own variation into the system, smooth, unvarying, the kind of rhythm that a machine would produce if the machine were perfect. Dogwang listened, nodded once, and turned to Mokjae. Steady J, same beat, slow is smooth. Mokje was at the treadle, both hands on the frame for balance, his face set with the expression of someone who has been failing at something for days and is not sure whether this time will be different. Slow is smooth, he repeated. Smooth is accurate. Accurate is everything. Again, Doguang said, slow is smooth. Smooth is accurate. Accurate is everything. Now do it with your feet. The tool touched the blank. The frame did not shudder. It absorbed. The stones packed into its hollow sections held their inertia against the cut, and the cut, narrower now, taken at a shallower bite, did not excite the frequency that the frame was willing to echo. Mokje drove the treadle in the cadence the Guang had drilled into him, slow and unvarying, and the blank turned past the tool at a rate that gave the steel time to part cleanly. A ribbon of steel peeled away from the blank, thin, unbroken, curling away from the cut in a single continuous spiral. The sound was different, lower, steadier, without the broken clock shrieking of the chatter. The surface behind the tool was not rippled. It was not perfect, but it was not rippled. Mokje kept his eyes on the treadle and his feet on the beat and thought, in the wordless way that the body thinks when it is doing something right for the first time, it's not screaming. Why isn't it screaming? He did not say it aloud. He kept his feet moving. Sareen measured. She had been there for most of the iteration runs, recording each result in her ledger with the same precise hand she used for everything: the date, the setup change, the measured deviation from nominal. Do-jin had come to rely on those records the way he relied on the three-plate reference surface, not because they told him what he wanted to hear, but because they told him what was true. She ran the measuring rod along the shaft, checked the readings at 3 stations, compared them to the reference marks she had made on the first day. Truer than the last by far, she said. She did not look up from the ledger, but still not true. Not yet. Good, Do-jin said. She looked up then, because that was not the answer she had expected. We don't celebrate better, he said. We celebrate true. Tomorrow we chase the last of it. They stood in the workshop in the late afternoon light, Taeho and Doguang and Mokje and Choyoung and Sorin, and the lathe with its stone-packed frame and its red-ground tool, and the shaft blank still between centers, truer than it had ever been and not yet true enough. The scrap pile was still there. It would be there until they had a use for the iron, which would be soon enough. The apprentices who had drifted away were still gone. The whispers were still out there somewhere in the town, doing what whispers do. None of that had changed. What had changed was the ribbon, one clean, unbroken ribbon of steel, peeled from a shaft that had refused to be true for days, by a frame heavy enough to hold still, and a tool ground to take a thinner bite, and a boy who had memorized a cadence until his feet knew it without his mind. Half of precision is human. Do-jin had known that in the abstract for years. He had watched it become true this afternoon, in a pine-framed workshop in a dying frontier town, and it was different from knowing it abstractly. We don't stop at better, he said, to the room, to himself, to the lathe. We stop at true. Tomorrow we finish it. No one answered. No one needed to. Mukje was already checking the treadle pivot for wear. Taeho was looking at the tool post with the expression of a man planning a modification he had not yet put into words. Doguang was writing something in the margin of his own small notebook, the cadence maybe, translated into marks that would let him teach it to someone else. The oil lamps were lit against the coming dark. Outside, the veil over Iron Ridge held its pale and failing light against the sky, the way it always did. The spindle had been on the mandrel for 6 hours. I had stopped counting the passes somewhere around the 4th hour, when the rhythm of the team finally stopped feeling like something I was conducting, and started feeling like something that simply existed, a shared breath, a shared pressure, a shared silence between strokes. Chayoung worked the treadle without being told to adjust. Baktaha held the steady rest with both hands, and did not shift his grip. Doguang fed the cutting tool at the angle we had established in the 2nd hour, and had not deviated from it since. Even Mokje, who had no assigned task, stood at the edge of the lamplight, and did not fidget. I watched the surface coming off in slivers, not chips, not curls, slivers, the kind that meant we were close enough to final dimension that the tool was barely kissing the work. The oil lamp threw long shadows across the wooden lathe bed, and the shadows moved in the same rhythm as the treadle, and for a moment the whole workshop felt like one organism with one purpose. Almost, I said. Hold the rhythm. Don't reach for it. Let it come. No one answered. That was correct. Reaching for the finish is how you overshoot it. The final pass came off. I did not say anything immediately. I lifted the spindle free of the mandrel with both hands, it was warm from the work, and carried it to the surface plate. Sorin was already there with the gauge, her ledger open beside her, the column of target measurements written in her careful hand. She had been recording every pass, every dimension, every deviation corrected, and the correction itself recorded, so that if we ever needed to make this spindle again, or a spindle like it, we would not be starting from memory. She set the gauge against the journal diameter, checked, set it against the taper, checked, moved to the flange face, and checked again. Her face in the lamplight was unreadable while she worked, which I had come to recognize as the expression she wore when she was being precise, when she was refusing to let what she hoped the measurement would say influence what she read it as. She looked up. It's to spec, she said. Every measure. A pause, and then something she clearly had not planned to say. It's true. Mokje did not have Sorin's restraint. He had been pressed against the doorframe, trying not to exist, and now he existed very loudly. We made it true. The sound broke something loose in the room. Choyoung sat down on the treadle bench and put his face in his hands, not from distress, but from the particular exhaustion of sustained precision finally permitted to end. Paek Tae-ho set his hands on his knees and let out a long breath through his nose. Do-gwang looked at the spindle in my hands, and then at the surface plate, and then at the gauge, and then at Sorin's ledger, and his expression moved through several things before settling on something that was not quite a smile, but was in the same neighborhood. I held the spindle up to the lamp. It was not beautiful in the way that decorative things are beautiful. It was beautiful in the way that a thing is beautiful when it is exactly what it needs to be and nothing else, when every surface exists because a surface was required there, when every dimension is the dimension and not an approximation of it. The taper ran true, the journal ran true. The flange face was flat to the plate within what our gauge could resolve. We had made it with a wooden treadle lathe and hand-ground tools, and a surface plate we had lapped ourselves by the three-plate method, and it was true. It was also a part. That was the thing I needed them to understand, and I turned to face the room with the spindle still in my hands, not a finished object, not an endpoint. A part, the heart of the next lathe, the iron one, the one that would be more rigid and more precise than the wooden one we had just used to make it, and which would therefore be capable of making parts more precise than itself, which would in turn make possible a lathe more precise still. Each generation of tooling enabling the next, each step up the staircase cut from the step below. We just stopped surviving, I said, and started climbing. No one said anything to that. They didn't need to. The spindle said it for me. He came in while we were still standing around the surface plate. I heard the palanquin before I saw it, the particular sound of lacquered wood and brass fittings carried by men who moved with the careful economy of people who had learned that their employer noticed everything. The bearers set it down in the yard, and Ryugyam stepped out, and the first thing I noticed was that he looked worse than the last time I had seen him. Not worse in the way that tired men look worse. Worse in the way that a lamp looks worse when the oil is running low. The light's still present, but the quality of it changed. Something diminished at the source. He looked at us through the open workshop door, at the lamplit room, at the surface plate, at the spindle still in my hands, at Serene's open ledger, at the team arranged around the evidence of 6 hours of sustained, deliberate work. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes moved. I did say I would return, he said, and here you are, celebrating. How fortunate I came in time to put a stop to it. The room went very still. He stepped inside without being invited. His robes were court formal. the kind that announced jurisdiction before a word was spoken, and he wore them with the ease of a man who had spent his entire life understanding that clothing was a form of argument. He looked at the wooden lathe. He looked at the surface plate and the three reference flats racked beside it. He looked at the gauge in Sarin's hand and at the ledger beneath it. These works cease today, he said. The smith's tools are forfeit. Refuse, and Iron Ridge answers for heresy. Bakteho's hands closed into fists at his sides. Choyoung went very still on the treadle bench. Dogwang's jaw set. Mokjae, who had been celebrating 30 seconds ago, pressed himself back against the doorframe and became very small. I set the spindle down on the surface plate, carefully. It had taken 6 hours, and I was not going to damage it now. Ryugyum's gaze moved to Sorin, and something in his manner shifted, not softening exactly, but recalibrating, the way a man recalibrates when he identifies the load-bearing point of a structure he intends to bring down. Lend the court your name, he said. A Yun returned, denouncing this folly, and I will spare the town and restore your house. Everything they took. He paused, and the pause was deliberate. One word. I watched Seirin's face. She had told me almost nothing about what she had lost. The shape of it I had assembled from fragments, a house name that still made older people in Iron Ridge go careful and quiet, a ledger-keeping habit that spoke of someone trained to account for things precisely because she had once had a great deal to account for, a way of standing in rooms that suggested she had grown up in rooms considerably larger than any she currently occupied. 20 years of whatever the court had done to House Yun had left her here, in a soot-stained workshop at the edge of the realm, recording spindle dimensions by lamplight. He was offering to undo all of it, with one word. I saw her work through it. It was not a quick calculation. It was the kind of reckoning that moves through a person slowly, touching everything, and I did not look away from her face because I needed to know what she was going to do, and I needed to know it before she said it, and I thought that if I watched carefully enough I would be able to tell. Everything I lost, with one word. She did not say anything for a long moment. Then the crowd outside, we had drawn a crowd, the kind that gathers when a court palanquin arrives in a frontier workshop yard, made a sound that was not a word, but was unmistakably alarm, a collective intake of breath with a specific shape. The near anchor, it's failing. The sound broke through the room like cold water. I knew what it meant before I moved toward the door, because I had been watching the anchors for weeks, and I knew the signs, the particular quality of light when a veil anchor began to lose cohesion, the way the air near a failing node felt different, thinner, as though the world were becoming slightly less certain of itself in that location. The near anchor was one of three that still held the veil over the inhabited quarter. If it failed, the coverage shrank. If the coverage shrank far enough, the outer families would be outside it. Ryugyam did not move toward the door. He watched Sarin. She looked at him, then she looked at me, then she looked at her ledger, still open on the surface plate, the columns of measurements in her careful hand, the record of every dimension we had achieved and how we had achieved it. She picked up the ledger. By my right as a daughter of House Yun, she said, I invoke the frontier statute. Works that defend a failing veil cannot be seized while it still fails. Her voice was even, the voice she used when she was reading measurements, and I have the measured record to prove it. Charge us, and you charge the court's own law. The room was very quiet. Ryugyam looked at her for a long moment. You would spend your blood on this? Something moved behind his eyes, not quite contempt, not quite something else. On soot and rabble? He reached for something. I did not know the precise mechanism by which mandate holders exercise their authority, but I had seen it enough times to recognize the gesture, the slight gathering of intention, the way the air near a strong mandate holder seemed to attend to them differently. He reached for it, and it came back to him diminished, and the expression on his face in the moment when he registered that diminishment was the most honest expression I had seen him wear. He was running low. Whatever he had come here to do, he did not have enough left to do it against a valid legal invocation backed by documentary evidence. The statute holds, he said, each word placed with care, the way you place a foot on uncertain ground. For now, he looked at Serin, and the look was not the look of a man who had been defeated. It was the look of a man who was revising his timeline. But the veil will fall, daughter of Yun, and I will be there. He left. The palanquin bearers lifted the lacquered box without being told, and the sound of it receded across the yard and down the ridge road, and then there was only the crowd outside and the failing anchor and the spindle on the surface plate. The anchor was worse than I had expected. I had stabilized them before, reached into the node with the same instinct I used when I was truing a piece by feel, finding the place where the energy wanted to go and giving it a path. It had worked 5 times. It had worked with diminishing returns each time, the way a weld repairs but does not restore, the way a patched bearing surface holds but not as it held when it was new. I pressed my hands against the anchor stone and felt the familiar wrongness of it, the vibration that should have been steady and was not, the gaps in the pattern where cohesion had simply ceased. I found what I could find and steadied it. The light above the near quarter stabilized, not recovered, stabilized, which was not the same thing. The crowd let out a collective breath. I stood up and looked at my hands. This is the last time any of them answer. We are out of road. The patches were spent. The anchors had been failing since before I arrived, and everything I had done to them had been buying time, and the account was now empty. Whatever was going to save Iron Ridge was going to have to be built, not borrowed. We had the spindle, we had the surface plate, we had a team that had just held 6 hours of precision work without breaking. We had Sorian's ledger and the process it recorded. We had to be faster. I walked back into the workshop. Celine was still standing at the surface plate with her ledger. The others were watching me with the particular attention of people who have just been through something and are waiting to understand what it means. You didn't have to spend your name on us, Sorin, I said. She looked at me for a moment. Then she looked at the spindle on the plate, and at the lathe that had made it, and at the 3 reference flats, and at the gauge, and at the ledger in her hands. My house's name bought nothing true in 20 years, she said. One true workshop is worth more than the whole rotted line. A pause. I am exactly where I mean to be. I did not have an answer for that. I did not think one was required. In the palanquin, moving down the ridge road in the dark, Ryugyam sat with his hands in his lap and looked at nothing. He had come to Iron Ridge expecting heresy, the usual frontier defiance, the usual small rebellion against the court's authority, the kind that collapsed when the mandate was applied with sufficient force. He had expected to find a blacksmith playing at philosophy and a disgraced noble girl keeping his accounts. He had expected to end it in an afternoon. What he had found instead was a surface plate, 3 reference flats lapped by the 3-plate method, a gauge, a ledger full of measurements, a spindle that ran true, that had been made to run true by a process that could be repeated, that had been recorded so that it could be repeated, that would be used to make a more precise machine that would make more precise parts still. They were not mocking the mandate. They're replacing it, and mine is almost gone. I have to end them before anyone else sees it. The palanquin moved through the dark, and the veil above Iron Ridge, what remained of it, threw a pale, uncertain light across the ridge behind him, and Ryugyam sat with his hands in his lap and understood, for the first time, that he was not dealing with a rebellion. He was dealing with a succession. Ji Wal-young was waiting in the workshop yard when I returned. She had been watching the anchor, or watching the road, or watching both. The warden had a habit of positioning herself where she could see the most things at once, which I had come to recognize as the habit of someone who had been responsible for this town for a long time and had learned that the threats rarely came from the direction you were watching. She looked at me, and then at the workshop, and then at the fading light of the near anchor above the quarter. The anchors are nearly done, Smith, she said. The dark is coming whether heaven permits it or not. She said it the way you say a thing you have known for a long time and have been waiting to say aloud. Be ready. I looked at the workshop, at the lamp still burning inside, at the spindle on the surface plate, at the team that had held 6 hours of precision work. The dark came on a moonless night, the way we always knew it would. The season we had spent racing against the dying veil, every heated bar, Every scraped surface, every argument about tolerances and tempering had been a race against this exact moment, and the moment had arrived to collect. I felt it before I heard it, a sound like the world exhaling its last breath, and then the anchor's light simply went out. Not a flicker, not a gradual dimming, gone. The anchor's gone, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. It's here. The blight poured through the tear in the veil, the way water pours through a broken dam. Not in a rush, but in a surge, a pressure that had been building for longer than any of us had been alive. The pale dome that had sheltered Iron Ridge for generations was no longer a dome at all. It was a wound in the sky, and through it came everything the veil had been holding back. Wardenji Wolyung was already moving. I had wondered, in quieter moments, what the warden would look like when the night she had been dreading finally arrived. The answer was, exactly like herself, only faster. Every hand to the wall. Her voice cut through the dark and the noise and the fear with the precision of a well-set chisel. Tonight we find out what the smith's iron is worth. It was a different town that answered her. I noticed that even in the chaos, the way the people moving toward the wall moved differently than they would have moved 3 months ago. There was drill in their bodies. There was the memory of repetition. They had practiced this, not because they believed it would happen, but because Dogwang had made them practice it until the motion lived in their muscles rather than their minds. The man himself was already at the wall, organizing the line with the calm efficiency of someone who had stood worse lines and survived them. One arm, one voice, and an authority that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with having earned it. Spears to the line, shot by the gun, and nobody crowds the muzzle, he said, walking the length of the cohort with his one good hand, checking grips and stances. You drilled for this. Ah, Master Do, Mukja's voice rang out from somewhere in the middle of the line, eager, frightened, trying to be the first of those two things and not the second. The arsenal they hauled out was the work of a season, tempered spear points that had been quenched in oil and drawn back to the right color rather than left glass-hard and brittle, brackets forged to true angles, holding the wall's reinforcement where old rope and prayer had held it before. And the cannon, the one piece I had lost the most sleep over, the one that had required the truest bore we could manage with the tools we had, the one that Baekdeo had sweated over for 2 weeks until the barrel was as close to round as we could make it without a proper boring mill. The blight hit the wall like a wave hitting a breakwater, and the wall held. I watched it hold. I watched the gate absorb the first push and not give. Watched the brackets do what brackets are supposed to do. Watched the reinforcement distribute the load the way it was meant to. 3 months ago, that first push would have ended the night. It did not end the night. The gate holds. Chi Wol-young's voice had something in it I had not heard before. Not relief, because relief comes after the danger passes, but something more immediate and more electric. Do you see? Their iron holds. Push them back. Dogwang held the center of the line. I have tried to find the right way to describe what he looked like in that moment, and I keep arriving at the same inadequate image, a man who had been thrown away standing in the place where the throwing away had been done, refusing to move. He had gathered around him the people Iron Ridge had also thrown away, the ones too old, too young, too broken, too foreign, too something to have been counted before, the discarded leading the discarded. You are not the people they threw away, he said, and his voice was not a shout, but it carried the length of the line anyway. Not tonight. Tonight you are the wall. Hold. They held. The cannon fired once, and the report of it rolled across the ridge and down into the valley like a judgment. The true bored barrel held. No split, no bulge, no catastrophic failure of the kind I had spent 3 months trying to prevent by getting the bore as close to round as our tools allowed. The shot broke the heaviest push of the night, scattered what had been a concentrated surge into something the spear line could manage. It held. I heard myself saying it before I had decided to say it. The barrel held. Reload, reload. The second push came from a direction we had not weighted heavily enough. The old palisade on the eastern stretch had been there since before the forge was rebuilt. It was the original wall, the one that had been good enough when the veil was strong enough to do most of the work. We had reinforced what we could reach and what we had time for. We had not reached all of it. The section gave way with a sound like a tree splitting in a storm, a crack, a groan, and then a gap where there had been wall. And the youngest of the line were standing right there. It's through. Mokjae's voice had lost the eagerness. It's through. Dogwang was already moving. I do not know how a one-armed man in his 50s covers ground that quickly, but he was at the breach before the line had fully understood what had happened, and he was moving in the wrong direction, not back, not to the sides, but into it. Back, all of you. He did not look behind him when he said it. He was already in the gap, already filling it with his body, the way you fill a breach with whatever material is to hand. Seal it behind me, go. Someone started to hesitate. Someone always hesitates. I have held worse lines than this, he said, and there was something in his voice that was not bravado. It was information, stated plainly, the way you state a measurement. Move, Jay, move. They sealed the breach behind him. The town lived, and so just barely did he. The dark had come close enough to taste. I will not describe what the breach looked like when we got to him afterward, because the point is not the wound, but the fact of his survival, and because some costs are better measured by what they purchased than by what they took. The man the world had discarded had spent very nearly everything defending the people who had once looked away from him, and he had never once, in any moment I witnessed, called it unfair. Master Do? Mokche was on his knees beside him before any of the rest of us reached the breach. The boy's hands were shaking, but they were pressing, holding, doing the right things by instinct or by the training Dogwang had given him. Stay with me, don't you dare. Held, the voice that came back was thin, the way a bar of iron is thin when you've drawn it out too far. But it was there. Worse lines than this. Dawn came the way dawn always comes after a night like that. Not triumphant, not gentle, just present. Light returning to a world that had not been certain it would see light again. No magic had saved Iron Ridge. Iron had, steel in numbers and stubborn discarded hands. We had paid for the proof in blood, but it was proof, the kind of proof that cannot be argued with, the kind that is written in the fact of everyone still standing, rather than in any document or decree. The blight had come, and the wall had held, and the wall had been made of tempered iron and drilled bodies, and one man who had decided that a breach was something a person could fill. He clung on through the dawn and through the day that followed. Yun So-rin changed his dressings with the careful precision she brought to everything she measured, her face giving nothing away except the concentration of someone doing work that mattered. Mokjae did not leave. I do not think anyone seriously suggested he should. The boy sat where he could see the foreman's chest rising and falling, and he watched it rise and fall, and that was what he did. The work had very nearly taken Dogwang. We learned what the cost weighed by almost paying it in full. Young sat with the boy through one of the longer nights, the two of them keeping a vigil that had no ceremony to it, just presence. He kept the line so we'd all still be here, she said quietly, looking at the bandaged figure on the mat. Don't you leave too, old man. Mokjae's voice, when it came, had the quality of someone choosing to believe something because the alternative was not survivable. He's still breathing. That means he's still teaching me, right? Nobody answered him. Nobody needed to. On the third day, the warden called the town together. Ji Wol-young stood in the square where the forge's chimney was visible above the roofline, where the smell of charcoal and hot iron had become as ordinary as the smell of pine, and she said what the night had already made true. The mandate is finished here. She said it without grief and without ceremony, the way you say a thing that has already happened and only needs to be acknowledged. From this day, Iron Ridge lives or dies by the forge, by the lathe, by what these hands can make. Every hand that can learn, you go to the smith. That is the law now. The foreman would mend, slowly and never quite whole. There would be watches he could not stand, loads he could not carry, a permanent diminishment that was the shape the breach had left in him. But he would mend, and in the days of the vigil and the slow recovery, the boy Dogwang had shielded, took up the load, so that there would be something worth waking up to. Mokje came to me on the fourth morning, with his sleeves already rolled, and his eyes carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who has not slept enough, but has decided that sleep is a problem for later. Teach me everything, he said. When he's back on his feet, I want to have earned it. I looked at him for a moment. The eager boy who had shouted "I, Master Do" into the dark was still in there, but there was something else in there now too, something that had been put in by the breach and the vigil and the decision to stay. Then we build, Jay, I said, so nobody bleeds for want of good iron again. That's the promise. The last light of the veil went out sometime in the days that followed, not with a sound, not with any drama, just a gradual dimming of the pale dome that had been Iron Ridge's sky for longer than anyone alive could remember, until one evening the sky above the ridge was simply dark, stars, and nothing else. Big Teho found me at the forge mouth, watching it happen. The blacksmith stood beside me with his arms folded and his face turned upward, and we watched the last of the old light go. "The sky's finally dark, Smith," he said. "Strange, I'm not afraid of it." The forge fire behind us was the brightest thing for a considerable distance in any direction. It was not a small light. It was the light of a fire that had been fed and tended and built up over a season of work. The light of a furnace that could reach temperatures the old charcoal pits never had. The light of a process that would repeat and improve and build on itself in the way that processes do when you get the method right. "The old light is going out everywhere," I said, "so we make our own." I let the thought settle for a moment before I added, "Tomorrow, the mother machine." The mother machine, the lathe that would cut the next lathe's lead screw, the first tool precise enough to make the next tool more precise, the beginning of the staircase. From somewhere behind us, from the direction of the low mat where a bandaged foreman was conducting his slow and stubborn recovery, a voice came, thin still, drawn out, but present. "Build it true, Smith." A pause, and I could hear the effort it cost him. "I'll be watching." We had our own light now, a forge fire, a true spindle, a machine half built that would build the next, and every one of us still here to build it. The age of the mandate was over, the age of iron had begun, and we were only on the first step of the staircase, the first riser of a climb that would take everything we had and ask for more, and that was exactly as it should be, because the staircase